For a significant chunk of the history of video games, it was a major overarching goal to eventually move from 2D to 3D. The first fully 3D game using polygonal graphics, you might be surprised to find out, was actually from 1983, a little game called iRobot. Thanks, Google. But it wasn't until the mid-90s that 3D games had started to become the norm. Graphics and technology had advanced to the point where even the lowest of low-rent developers could theoretically implement polygonal graphics. This of course led to the early to mid-90s Wild West that I was so fond of, where tons of developers of varying skill levels were individually attempting to test the waters to see what worked and what didn't work as far as 3D gaming was concerned. They were the pioneers, the groundbreakers. And while the cream of the crop has risen to the top in the grandness of time, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of examples of attempts at 3D games that completely fell flat due to a combination of inexperience with the added perspective and the general jankiness that came with the technology limitations as well as the new technology. And while it may not have been the worst, one of the more notorious examples of that transition from 2D to 3D would be Prince of Persia 3D. Now, Prince of Persia was a big deal for its day. It's still a relatively big IP, but it's been surpassed. It was the innovator of the realistic platformer genre. Featuring gorgeous rotoscoped animations, it stood out instantly among its contemporaries. I played it back in the day. It was one of the first PC games I remember playing. Of course, I could never get past the first level because it was brutally difficult. But it was an innovator, it sold well, and it launched an entire franchise of games, starting with the sequel, Prince of Persia 2: The Shadow and the Flame, and Knuckles. And of course the third game, and as was the style at the time, when you had a third game in a trilogy and it went to 3D, you didn't call it 3, you called it 3D. Hence Prince of Persia 3D in 1999. A game considered bad enough to have temporarily killed the Prince of Persia IP, and for some reason, this game is one that intrigues me, and I can't quite articulate why. I remember seeing the Dreamcast port at my local retro game shop back when I was in university. Keep in mind, I was living off my savings at the time, and something about this game grabbed me to the point where I was willing to spend $60 on it sight unseen. I guess its reputation preceded it. I wanted to see for myself if it really was one of the worst adaptations of a 2D game to 3D, and if it was truly as bad as its reputation would lead you to believe. I wanted to see all the ways in which you can botch a 3D adaptation. So that's going to be the theme for the day: botched conversions. I'm going to be discussing both versions. I'll probably be focusing a bit more on the Dreamcast port because that's the version that I have more familiarity with. Also, it's the version that controls halfway decently, but rest assured, both versions will get their due. I'm not overly familiar with the Prince of Persia lore, especially pre-Sands of Time, so I'm not sure how much connection 3D has to the previous two games. Through a little bit of research, I found out that apparently Prince of Persia 2 ended on a cliffhanger that was never resolved, so apparently the answer is not very much. As it sits, the prince, that's you, the sultan, as well as the prince's recent bride have all been invited to the palace of a neighboring country belonging to the sultan's brother Hassan. However, as it turns out, it's a trap. Apparently, there was a previous promise between the two sultans that the princess would marry Hassan's son Ragnar, but the Prince of Persia marrying the princess broke that promise, and so now deep behind enemy lines, the prince is captured and thrown into the dungeons while Ragnar attempts to persuade the princess to marry him. Also, Ragnar is half tiger for no discernible reason other than to appease the furries. It's about as on par as what you would expect for the era, as well as this sort of game. Prince rescues the princess, A plus B equals C. There's minimal twists, and a large chunk of the game is simply the chase. There's a part where the Sultan dies and the prince is framed, but that doesn't really lead anywhere, and the one interesting part of the plot is how the princess defies Ragnar, refuses his advances, and cuts off his hand. That's pretty metal. Which ends up leading to one of the more unintentionally funny moments in the game. Following this, he decides he doesn't want to marry her. He decides instead to punish her by tying her to a giant gear in the middle of a clock tower, meaning when the clock strikes a certain time, she'll be crushed, and the prince would then metaphorically be crushed as well. Otherwise than that little twist, it's a serviceable plot that gets the job done. Not much to really analyze, which is fair enough because the real interesting aspect of the game to analyze is the gameplay. Nobody really ever complained about the plot, it was all about that gameplay, and that's for one simple reason. The gameplay is completely whack. And in some ways, it's kind of a checklist of all the ways not to convert a 2D action game into 3D. There are a few major examples to bring up right off the bat, but the single most important thing to bring up immediately in my eyes is the absolutely atrocious combat. I don't use the term atrocious idly here. This might actually be the worst combat engine I've ever seen in a game. I see what they were going for here, don't get me wrong. The sword combat in the previous games was very simple. It basically boiled sword combat down to its simplest form. You block enemy attacks, and then you get a free hit, and if you attack, there's a chance that they may block your attack, and they get a free hit. So mastering blocking essentially breaks the combat. It's simple, which is fair enough. There are only so many ways you can make a combat engine like this, especially when you're dealing with only 2 dimensions. So keeping it simple and to the point with very few rules was a no-brainer. But in 3D, there are so many different ways you can make the combat more nuanced, especially in regards to integrating it into your traversal like the later Prince of Persia games did, or simply using the added perspective to add more depth to your arsenal. But instead, they essentially made a shot-for-shot transition of the combat from the first 2 games, where you have a normal mode and then you have a combat mode. You go into combat stance, and you walk laboriously towards whatever enemy is in front of you, and you haphazardly slash at each other until somebody dies. I could not for the life of me figure out the combat engine because it seems like the entire point is to block and then attack, but in practice it feels like you're flailing at each other aimlessly, especially because different attacks don't appear to have a higher chance of hitting. And the audio-visual feedback for hitting an enemy is basically non-existent. It feels like your attacks are just clipping through one another with no resistance and very little actual presentation. Also, blocking doesn't seem to guarantee that your next strike will hit. It's essentially completely random unless I'm doing something wrong. And it's entirely possible I'm doing something wrong, but from my experience, it's basically impossible to get through any combat scenario without losing some health, unless you get supremely lucky. As a matter of fact, given that this is random chance, I find it's actually expedient to quick save before every combat scenario, and if you lose more health than necessary, just quick load and hope the odds favor you more. Obviously, that's not necessarily an option in the Dreamcast version, which is just as well, because the combat in the PC version is somehow the worst of the 2. The PC version makes the combat feel even more flaily and random. There's even less of a feeling of hit detection, and the AI is so brain dead that half the time you can kill the enemies while they're still walking towards you. Though funny story, I prefer WASD over the arrow keys for movement. It's a force of habit type deal. The left analog stick has become the default analog stick for movement in 3D gaming for the past god knows how many years, so to me the left hand is for movement regardless of control method. But the default attack directions are also with WASD in this game, and I didn't register that fact. I thought the movement controls were replaced by the attack directions, so I thought for the first hour of gameplay that you couldn't move during combat. But the fact that the combat is so static that I didn't even need to move during the combat is a point against it, not for it. And it's definitely not technology limitations because I found so many games from this era with superb combat engines. It all simply comes down to trying and failing to translate pre-established combat into 3D, and it simply doesn't work. Which is sad because they definitely put a lot of effort into it, given that there are several different weapons you can get. Both versions have unique weapons, like these dual blades in the PC version, but personally I think the Dreamcast version has the better weapons. Even though most of them just serve to make the combat situationally easier, like the sword that prevents you from being shot with arrows while it's drawn, which is useful all of like once in the entire game. But then you also have such things as the fire sword, which simply does more damage. We even have a sword that doesn't look like a sword at all because it's a bow and arrow. And you're given different arrows you can fire, which can be quite useful, though gameplay hot tip, save anything that insta-kills enemies for the final boss, either arrows or swords. Because since the thing is on a time limit on account of your wife being tied to a giant gear, you want to spend as little time fighting him as possible. And anything death-based does one entire section of damage. Overall, the combat just isn't particularly enjoyable because it's so static and so completely one-dimensional. I'm not speaking with any hyperbole when I say this might be one of the worst combat engines I've ever experienced, if not the worst. And the fact that the damage you take is seemingly so random, it's almost more expedient not to bother. Yeah, at some point during my initial playthrough, I found that there are very few combat scenarios that were necessary. There are a few combat scenarios very early on that are required to continue, but after a certain point, there's nothing stopping you from just running past a lot of these obstacles. And as a matter of fact, it's actually better to do so because there are limited healing items. In the PC version, every healing item is a one and done. You can't store them, so you either drink them on the spot or you move on if you don't need them. So there are times where you might need them but don't have them, and then in the Dreamcast version you can save 4 healing items, so you want to save your healing items for the more important fights. Meaning it's better to just simply not bother with a lot of the lesser fights. Most enemies don't even follow you past certain points of no return, and some of them are even blocked by loading screens. Besides, it's not like you get anything for fighting most enemies. Outside of the odd healing item, there's no reward for fighting. The fighting is largely done as an obstacle in your way, but the environments are big enough that they're barely in your way. There's even at least one instance I can think of off the top of my head where killing one enemy will spawn a harder enemy, so if you just run past the easier enemy, you don't have to deal with the extra gameplay challenge. Imagine this, viewers. The combat is so inherently unfun, so unsatisfying, and so haphazard that not engaging with it, not engaging with one of the core mechanics, makes the game more fun. How sad is that? So yeah, I appreciate the effort, it's just a damn shame the design philosophies were misplaced, and the overall result was completely shithouse. I feel like there are certain aspects of the game that do work in 3D. Most notably, I think the platforming and traversal is actually quite fun and nuanced at times. It's slow and at times laborious, but I feel like the added weight of having realistic platforming scenarios makes the slowness compelling because it makes successfully pulling off simple but difficult challenges really rewarding. There are a lot of instances where you have to, much like the previous games, perform incredibly tightly done sequences of platforming. For example, it's not enough just to be able to swing across a pit of spikes, you also have to grab onto the edge because there are spikes at the top, so if you swing too far, you die. This was a staple of Prince of Persia design, not only knowing where to go and when to jump, but also these specific distances to stand back so you don't overshoot and find yourself in the midst of a hazard. And some of those later sequences are really satisfying to get through, like this one part towards the end of the game where you have to jump in a specific way to grab onto the edge but also not hit the spikes. Then you need to drop down, swing on a pole, and then swing to a stationary rope. That took a number of tries. The comparison to Tomb Raider is somewhat unavoidable, given that both are 3D action-adventure games with lots of box pushing, climbing, platforming, and falling to your death after misjudging the length of a jump. It's hard for me to say whether or not this is actually a Tomb Raider ripoff. The platforming was definitely trying to take the same design philosophies, so they may have used Tomb Raider as somewhat of an inspiration as far as level design or how to control the character in 3D. But then again, Prince of Persia came first and could very well have been taking the same design philosophies and converting them to 3D. It's hard to say. It's one of those chicken and egg situations where you can't be sure where the inspiration comes from. To me, it comes across simply as the fact that 3D Prince of Persia would always be reminiscent of Tomb Raider, and Tomb Raider was wildly popular at the time, so you're never going to get away from that. You're never going to get away from the comparison. Even still, if we're going with the parallels to Tomb Raider, I also don't think that Tomb Raider in its earliest form controlled particularly well. Matter of fact, given that early Tomb Raider came before analog movement or dual analog controls, I found the control workarounds they did implement to make the game functional with limited technology was awkward and has aged poorly. The same definitely applies here. It may not be as dire, but it's in the same direction. I find the type of gameplay they were going for needed far more than what the Dreamcast controller gave you. You needed proper camera controls, you needed the extra buttons of a more standard controller, you needed the extra precision that a dual analog setup would give you. It's acceptable, but it feels like it's held back by its limitations and needed something more. It's at least playable though. Meanwhile, the PC version is practically unplayable as far as the controls are concerned. But it has nothing to do with the actual specific button inputs themselves, because I actually rearranged the button inputs to something that I like. The larger issue is the fact that the controls feel strangely unresponsive on the PC, and this applies to every aspect of the game, even combat. Sometimes I would click the button to pull out my sword and the prince just wouldn't do it, causing me to have to reload the combat sequence because I was standing there while I was being cut to ribbon. But it was even worse for platforming. I had to quick save pretty much before every single jump because it was even odds whether or not I would actually properly jump or if the prince would arbitrarily fall to his death. Sometimes I was smacking the jump key 5 times just to make sure that he would actually jump. And the funny thing is, it only really applied during running jumps. I can do stationary jumps just fine, but for some reason, trying to get him to do a running jump and actually, jump was more art than science. And it gets even worse when you have to swing on a rope. I swear, trying to collide with the rope required an act of God half the time. Meaning that this game got very difficult very quick in any circumstance where quick precision was required. The only saving grace is the quick save and quick load. Without that, I'd have packed the PC version in after 15 minutes. It also doesn't help that the PC version is seemingly poorly optimized. I think anyway. My virtual machine is a beefcake. I specifically set up my virtual machine to basically be able to run anything pre-2004 at max settings. So the game has no right to be chugging as hard as it is. And when you combine the shoddy frame rate with the really unresponsive controls, it makes the PC version come across as even less fun when it already wasn't exactly a Game of the Year contender to begin with. I will acquiesce to the fact that it may not be the game's fault on account of the virtual machine. I'm no expert in retro PC games, hence why I try to avoid them as much as I can, so I'm not sure if it's the emulation's fault. To its credit though, it wasn't as glitchy as I expected. I heard that this was an incredibly glitchy game, but in my experience, I don't remember encountering any glitches, and this is the 1.0 version. Since I ripped this game from an abandonware website, it wasn't installed on my virtual machine in the traditional sense, so I couldn't patch it. But the fact that there was a keyboard fix I couldn't figure out how to implement properly probably means the unresponsiveness of the controls aren't anything new or groundbreaking as far as takes are concerned. But still, no glitches from what I could tell. I think the textures briefly disappeared at one point, and you could probably tell this game was rushed graphically given the abundance of flat textures and the fact that the prince himself looks really weird. Something just seems off about his face, like he's a 3D render of a political cartoon. Otherwise than that, the game was stable enough. But even if the game controlled well, had better combat, had equally good performance on both the Dreamcast and the PC, it still wouldn't fix what is probably the most annoying issue with Prince of Persia 3D/Arabian Nights, the arbitrary death traps. Yes, I know that instant kill death traps were a staple of Prince of Persia, but there's a reason why they worked in 2D. When you're viewing the game from the side, you're seeing an entire screen's worth of game environment. You were able to reasonably suss out what is and is not a trap from a distance, because you can see a large chunk of the immediate surrounding playable space. This wasn't always the case, of course. There were cases of trial and error in the original games, as was the style at the time, but at the very least, if something was an obvious trap, you could reasonably predict it because of the extremely wide field of view. The problem is now, in 3D and in third person, your perception of the environment shrinks a lot. It basically shrinks to your immediate surroundings and not much else. When you combine that with the fact that these games have a significantly lower resolution than the average game these days, it creates a toxic cocktail where you have no reasonable way to predict when something is going to pop out in front of you and kill you instantly until it does. It's hard to see a lot of these things because they blend into the environment in a lot of instances. You have to have eagle eyes to predict when half of these hazards are going to show up. Sometimes even that's not enough, like how in the PC version, there were these columns that rise up from the ground and crush you. But there's no immediately obvious indication of how you're supposed to know that these specific spots have the crushing mechanisms. It's to the point where in the Dreamcast version they actually had to add different colored tiles in those spots to indicate that those spots were hazards. But even the Dreamcast version doesn't get away from this. Oh no, there were several instances in the Dreamcast version where I found myself casually walking through the environment and getting decapitated by a guillotine or getting chomped by a mechanism because there was no visual indication. Once again, if you could see the entire environment around you, like in the 2D games, you'd be able to immediately see a giant hanging blade above you. But because in this case you generally only see the area immediately surrounding you, you rarely need to look up so it wouldn't have crossed your mind. So this is always going to kill you the first time. It's a guarantee. It does give me pause, because the very next game in the Prince of Persia series after this, it gave you the ability to rewind time up to a certain point. And it makes me wonder if this was a design solution to implementing these death traps and otherwise getting around situations where one wrong maneuver will cause you to fall to your death. It makes sense if that were the case, because it's a simple but no doubt difficult to program means of getting around design issues like this. But we're not talking about Sands of Time, we're talking about Prince of Persia 3D/Arabian Nights. All of this combines to create a game that, despite moments of enjoyment, is fascinatingly awful. It's a complete mess of misguided and poor design, and it all comes down to one issue. They tried to faithfully adapt the gameplay from 2D to 3D, but they clearly didn't test much, or if they did, they didn't have the time to meaningfully implement any sort of change to the design because it's flawed at a fundamental level and would require an entire design overhaul. But either way, they tried to preserve the simple combat of the 2D games, despite the fact that going to 3D opened them up to much greater depth of sword combat, and the result is awful. Translating the precision platforming that required incredibly precise movement didn't really work because the technology just wasn't there to have that sort of gameplay control well in 3D. It was made worse by the controls in the PC version, and the trademark death traps that define the experience of a Prince of Persia game were outright rendered visually indistinct with the more complicated graphics and the reduced viewpoint that they had. Basically, this game fails on a fundamental level due to accuracy. Now that I've played it though, does its reputation hold up? Is it one of the worst translations from 2D to 3D? I don't think so. It's at least playable and has some enjoyable aspects. Like I said, when the platforming is at its best, there are some pretty enjoyable sequences. Meanwhile, I think the gold standard for terrible 3D transitions would be Bubsy 3D. But then again, a birthday cake made of manure would look favorable standing next to Bubsy 3D. Then there's also Mega Man X7, where from what I understand, Keiji Inafune actively shot down any developer's attempts to try and design the game for 3D space, assuming that simply taking the same design philosophies and converting it to 3D would make an equally good game. Not what it ended up being, one of the worst Mega Man games ever made. Though to be fair, apparently that may have been referencing the graphics specifically, but given the design of the game, if they weren't specifically trying to take 2D sensibilities and convert it to 3D without any sort of translation or any sort of idea about how 3D space is utilized compared to 2D, well, the game certainly doesn't do a good job of convincing you of that fact. And then there's something like Robotron X, which was a 3D remake of the 80s arcade game Robotron, and without wishing to be dramatic, it's the worst f***ing game I've ever played. Whereas Prince of Persia 3D is still fundamentally poorly designed and should still be held as a poor example of what it goes for, even if there are worse games than it. Still, the lessons to be learned from it are obsolete. Not to assume that design philosophies can carry over seamlessly from situation to situation. You need to design for what you're making. Don't make a first-person shooter with the design philosophies of a 3D platformer. Don't make a real-time strategy game with the design philosophies of a rhythm game. But these are obvious lessons that every game developer worth their salt should already know. So it's not really worth banging on about. It's only for the lulz that we look back on examples of games that failed at this very simple design philosophy. Even still, I do find myself weirdly captivated by Prince of Persia 3D / Arabian Nights. I mean, I've beaten the Dreamcast version twice now, so there must be something to this game that fascinates me for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it's a weird one-off deviation from the rest of the series. You had the first two games, you had the Sands of Time trilogy, you had a few other things, and then right in the middle you have this odd duck just sitting there. And I'm a fan of odd ducks in larger franchises. The same reason why I'm fascinated by something like Resident Evil Dead Aim. Because it's an intriguing but also largely forgotten one-off. I guess I'll just sum it up like this. I'm weird. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, subscribe, tell me what you think in the comment section, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.